Yellow Vest protest, the movement that has put Paris on edge. In Paris, the broken glass and empty tear gas canisters have been swept away and the graffiti scrubbed off the major monuments, among them the Arc de Triomphe. After a weekend of violent protest in the capital by a grassroots movement that calls itself the Yellow Vest, it was the third weekend of protests and confrontations with the police by the group, and by far the most damaging. The cost of repairing just the Arc de Triomphe, apart from the graffiti, there was damage to artifacts kept inside, could reach €1 million, about $1.5 million. According to the Center for National Monuments, on Monday, merchants and government officials were assessing the total property damage. More than 260 people were wounded nationwide, and at least 3 people died outside Paris on the margins of the protests over the last 3 weekends. More than 400 people were arrested in Paris. The government kept an aloof stance towards the protest until late last week, hoping the movement would peter out. Now the government is shifting its approach. Who are the Yellow Vests? The movement originated in May when a woman named Priscilla Lakowski, who has an internet cosmetic business and lives in the suburbs southeast of Paris, launched an internet petition calling for a drop in gas prices. She broke down the price into its components, noting that taxes make up more than half the cost in France. Per liter, lead-free gas was 1.41 euros on Sunday, or about $6 per gallon. The petition went mostly unnoticed until October, when Eric Drouet, a truck driver from the same area as Ms. Lukowski, ran across it and circulated it among his Facebook friends. Newspapers have been writing about the petition, and the number of signatures skyrocketed from an initial 700 to 200,000. Today it has more than 1.15 million signatures and counting. When Mr. Drouet decided to hold a car rally come protest on November 17th to demand lower gas prices, word spread on social media. Soon, autonomous groups formed in many French departments, subdivisions of the country's 13 regions, and decided to hold their own protest. Early on, people who agreed with the petition were encouraged to show their support by displaying the high visibility yellow vest every driver in France must by law carry in case of roadside trouble. Supporters were asked to place the vest on the dashboard or back shelf. Those who participated were predominantly men and women who rely on their cars to get to work and take care of their families. In the mix were small business owners, independent contractors, farmers, homemaids, nurses, and truck drivers. They live and work primarily in rural towns and in the suburbs or exurbs of France's biggest cities, many earning just enough to get by. How big is the movement? No one knows for sure. By French standards, the demonstrations have been modest in size, but they are unusual in that they erupted spontaneously in multiple places around France, without any union or political party organizing them. Their numbers have diminished since the first gathering on November 17th, where nearly 300,000 Yellow Vests protested nationwide. This past weekend it was 166,000, according to the Interior Ministry. Many people who have not participated in the protests say they support them or are sympathetic to those on the street. That suggests that a protest may again grow in size or continue for a long time. Despite the damage over the weekend in Paris and elsewhere, overall support for the movement remains high, according to several polls. Why are they so angry? Many protesters say that their purchasing power dwindled so much over the years that they have trouble making ends meet, let alone coming up with the money for simple outings, vacations, or even just to go out to dinner once in a while. They are earning close to the median income, but costs have risen and pay has not. The median earner in 2016 in France took home about 1,700 euros, $1,930 a month, but that means half of the French took home less. The income has to cover rent, food, utilities, clothing, as well as the cost of fuel. Protesters clashing with French riot police on the Champs-Élysées on Saturday. Some of the movement's supporters say if they were poor, the government would help them with subsidies, but like the working poor in other Western countries, they are above the poverty line and unable to take advantage of government support. The gas tax, which is slated to rise again in January by a few cents per liter, is often described by the French as the drop of water that makes the vase overflow. Since public transportation is limited in rural France and suburbs, most of the yellow vests have no choice but to use their cars and are especially sensitive to fuel tax hikes. And that tax comes on top of already high payroll taxes that help the government pay for the healthcare system, Social Security, and unemployment insurance, amongst other things. What do yellow vests want? Their demands span a broad spectrum. The movement has so many participants with different circumstances and politics that it is hard to imagine everyone agreeing on a single list of demands. Self-described moderate yellow vest who wrote an opinion piece on Sunday in a French newspaper, Le Journal du Dimanche, said a freeze on the planned gas tax increase was a precondition for negotiating with the government. Others have called for Emmanuel Macron's resignation, and some say Parliament should dissolve itself and hold new elections. What is the government's response? The government initially dug in its heels. Mr. Macron said there would be no modification of the planned tax increase, nor of other policies designed to reduce France's carbon footprint and move to less polluting energy sources. But after 3 weeks of protests, each more violent than the last, the government seems to be taking stock of its options. Although neither Mr. Macron nor his Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe, have suggested that they would consider a moratorium on the tax increases, many members of Parliament are calling for a suspension of the tax. Mr. Macron, who was away this past weekend at a G20 summit in Argentina, has yet to speak publicly about the situation. Many politicians on the left and right, and some in his own party, say he needs to respond. The president has postponed a trip to Serbia, canceled some meetings, and he asked the prime minister to meet with the leaders of French political parties and also the Yellow Vest representatives. The meetings with Yellow Vest have not yet been scheduled, in part because it is unclear who represents them. Although several people have emerged and described themselves as representatives of the Yellow Vests, it appears they have little sway with others in the movement. On Sunday, the self-selected representatives said they could meet with Mr. Philippe, but on Monday they backed away after threats and protests from other Yellow Vests. How big is the threat? How big a threat are they to the government? No one knows, and the government itself appears unsure, vacillating between a more open approach and doubling down on the use of force to stop the unrest. If Mr. Macron stays the course and goes through with the tax increase, there are political hazards. The decision could prompt many more people to join the protest, like resulting in more violence and more property damage. But bowing to the protesters' demands and seeming to cave into the French street has political downsides as well. If the government seizes on the moratorium on gas tax, it might satisfy protesters, but others then may escalate their demands. Are there more protests expected? Unless the government does something more to reach out to the working poor, small business owners, and independent contractors, and to all those who live outside wealthy areas of Paris and other big cities, the unrest seems likely to spread. This is predicted. This is something I've talked about this for the last couple of years. Actually, I've talked about this for more than the last couple of years. The French actually, a quarter of their GDP comes from the continent of Africa. There are 14 African colonies. And since the French are, I do believe the French system is like 130% over GDP. Their budget is like 130% over GDP, so that means they borrow heavily. A lot of that extra money has to come from Africa. And the French are already very sensitive about their, I wouldn't say welfare. What I'm saying is, which is the benefits they get from the French government. That's how come their taxes are so high. But since the French cannot get it from the African colonies to maintain the system, it has to come from somewhere. Guess where it comes from? You guessed it. It's coming from the workers, it's coming from the people. But the people are used to a certain lifestyle. And when they can't get that lifestyle, you're going to get what you get, which is turns out to be Yellow Vest protests. And this is not going to stop because The Africans want the French off the tit. And if the French aren't on the tit, then they can't afford to bribe their workers or their citizens with generous benefits. And the benefits don't get so generous anymore. That means there's going to be austerity. And it's been proven that the French people do not take kindly to austerity. They will protest, they will riot, they will do whatever, which is what they're doing right now. So if I had to guess, it's going to get worse. I think there's other, how can I say, solutions in the background that are a little bit more unsavory, especially toward black folks. But I got one more to do. It's going to be on the African part, which is CFA. We're going to revisit this, the yellow vest, because it's not going away. Because this is a important to what could happen in the United States if something happens, when something happens to the dollar, when the world starts to de-dollarize, and then the semi-generous lifestyle that the United States affords us start to slip. How will we react? So far, we've reacted by putting dope in our veins. What happens when that's not enough? Or automation takes your jobs, or any one of a number of other things that could happen. That's another thing we're going to explore. Not today, but sometime this week. Anyway, that's enough of this one. I'm going to jump off here. This is BGS out, and I will see you guys on the next one.